In 1998, at the start of her overnight shift, Lily Ledbetter checks her mailbox at the Goodyear tire plant in Gadsden, Alabama. Inside is an anonymous note. On it, someone has written her monthly pay, and the pay of 3 men who started the same year, doing the same job. She's making $3,727 a month. The lowest paid man on that list is making $4,286. Ledbetter had worked at Goodyear for 19 years. 19 years of strong performance reviews. 19 years of never quite knowing she was being shorted because the company had a policy that made discussing pay taboo. She sued. A jury sided with her and awarded her over $3 million. The Supreme Court threw that out on a technicality, ruling she'd waited too long to file, even though she had no way of knowing for 19 years that there was anything to file about. Ledbetter's case became federal law, but her personal story never got fixed. The real story here isn't just discrimination. It's what happens in the silence before a note like that ever gets written. The moment where a number gets set once, gets accepted once, and then compounds invisibly for decades. Here's the psychological mechanism behind that silence, and it has a name: anchoring. In 2001, researchers Adam Galinsky and Thomas Musweiler ran a series of negotiation experiments that have since become some of the most cited studies in behavioral economics. Their finding was blunt. Whoever makes the first offer in a negotiation wins, on average. Not because that number is fair, because the other side's brain immediately starts calculating outward from it. When a seller opens high, the final price lands higher. When a buyer opens low, the final price lands lower. A later meta-analysis of negotiation studies found the correlation between the opening offer and the final outcome to be nearly 0.5, one of the strongest, most consistent effects in all of behavioral economics. Apply that to a job offer. A company names a number first. That number isn't just a starting point for discussion. It quietly becomes the frame your brain uses to judge every counteroffer from that point forward. Ask for 10% more, and it can feel aggressive, even greedy, even when the number you're asking for is still below market rate. The anchor was never neutral. It was strategically the company's first move, and most candidates never even register it as a move at all. Now here's where this becomes a compounding problem instead of a one-time mistake. Economist Linda Babcock at Carnegie Mellon ran a study on graduating MBA students that's become one of the most cited findings in negotiation research. She found that 57% of male graduates negotiated their starting salary. Among female graduates, it was 7%, 8 times fewer. The students who did negotiate, regardless of gender, increased their starting salary by 7.4% on average. That number is not a coincidence. It's almost exactly the size of the pay gap Babcock found in that same graduating class. Same degree, same school, same job market. The single biggest driver of the difference wasn't skill or experience or even discrimination at the offer stage. It was who asked and who didn't. And a starting salary isn't a one-time number. Most raises, bonuses, and future offers get calculated as a percentage increase on top of whatever you're already making. A gap that opens in year 1 doesn't stay flat. It compounds through every review, every job change, every negotiation that follows, which is exactly how a 7% difference at graduation quietly turns into a career-long gap that looks, decades later, indistinguishable from the number on Lily Ledbetter's anonymous note. So if asking is worth roughly 7%, why doesn't everyone just ask? Part of it is the anchoring effect itself. Once a number's on the table, countering it feels like conflict, not negotiation. But there's a second mechanism, and it's more specific than simple hesitation. In 2007, Hannah Riley Bowles at Harvard, working with Babcock and researcher Lei Lai, ran an experiment where evaluators watched identical negotiation scripts, performed once by a man, once by a woman. When the male candidate asked for more money, evaluators rated him neutrally or even more favorably. When the female candidate asked for the exact same amount, using the exact same words, evaluators rated her less likable and were less willing to work with her. That's not a confidence gap. That's a rational response to a real, measurable social cost that only one side of the negotiation table has to pay. Which means the advice to simply ask more was never the full picture. The women in Babcock's original study weren't failing to negotiate because they didn't understand their own value. Many were accurately predicting a penalty that the research later proved was real. Here's the part that makes this genuinely more interesting than a simple morality tale. More recent research has found that the negotiation gap Babcock first identified has narrowed substantially. In some newer studies of MBA graduates, women now negotiate starting pay at rates close to or even above their male peers. And yet, the pay gap hasn't closed. In the US, women's earnings have hovered between 80 and 82% of men's for most of the past 2 decades, even as the willingness to ask gap shrinks, which points to something more structural than a single negotiating table. If the ask rate gap is closing, but the pay gap isn't, the anchor was never just about who speaks first in one conversation. It's about which jobs get offered to which candidates in the first place, which roles lead to promotion tracks, and which starting numbers get set low before anyone gets the chance to counter them. Why the silence feels normal. None of this requires a company acting in bad faith to keep working the way it does. Ledbetter's employer didn't need to announce a pay gap out loud. It just needed a policy that discouraged employees from comparing notes and a first offer number that most people were never trained to question. That's the quiet mechanism behind nearly every one of these stories. Not a single dramatic decision, but a small, repeated default. One number, offered once, rarely challenged, compounding silently for years, until occasionally an anonymous note in a mailbox is the only thing that makes it visible at all. The instinct to accept the first number on the table isn't a personal failure of confidence. It's a predictable, well-documented response to a psychological anchor that was designed, intentionally or not, to work exactly the way it does. The research says asking is worth roughly 7%. The research also says for some people, asking carries a real cost that the other side of the table never has to pay. Lily Ledbetter didn't find out about her gap for 19 years. Most people never find out at all. The note never comes. The number just quietly becomes the whole story, and nobody ever finds out what the other version would have looked like.